A white nationalist rally spirals out of control. A driver plows into protesters. One dead, dozens injured. Now a state of emergency.
We condemn in the strongest possible terms this egregious display of hatred, bigotry, and violence on many sides. On many sides.
What did he mean by many sides? The president's refusal to single out the white supremacists who sparked the bloodshed is drawing fire from Democrats and Republicans. All the fallout this morning. And nuclear bluster.
They will be met with fire and fury.
Tension with North Korea escalates as Kim Jong-un vows to respond with absolute force. Is the war of words spinning out of control or setting the stage for new diplomacy? Our Martha Raddatz is live at the DMZ.
While the rhetoric ramps up in Washington and Pyongyang, here on the border, there is no sign of imminent conflict.
And the latest from the White House with National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster. Plus, he debuted with a bang.
Here's what I will tell you, okay? I love the president.
And Ryan is paranoid schizophrenic, paranoiac.
11 days later, Anthony Scaramucci was out of the White House. This week, he joins us live for his first interview since the firing, a This Week exclusive. We'll break down the politics, smoke out the spin, the facts that matter this week.
From ABC News, it's This Week. Here now, Chief Anchor George Stephanopoulos.
August is never as quiet as we expect it to be, and this week sure proved that rule. Dangerous nuclear threats overseas, an act of domestic terror here at home. This was the scene in Charlottesville, Virginia, Saturday afternoon. A gray Dodge Charger with blacked out windows plows into marchers protesting a planned rally by white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and members of the KKK. After ramming into one group, the driver accelerated in reverse, running over several more. One woman is dead, 19 more injured. The driver, James Alex Fields Jr., a 20-year-old from Ohio. He's been charged with murder. The FBI and Department of Justice have opened a civil rights investigation. Later, 2 Virginia State police officers also died when their helicopter crashed as they responded to the violence. A bloody end to a chaotic 24 hours that began when white nationalists chanting Nazi slogans, carrying torches and Confederate flags gathered in Charlottesville, vowing to take America back. They clashed with counter-protesters, some with Black Lives Matter posters, who came to support Charlottesville's decision to take down the statue of Robert E. Lee. Virginia Governor Terry McAuliffe called off the rally, declared a state of emergency. After the car attack, President Trump made this statement from Bedminster.
We condemn in the strongest possible terms this egregious display of hatred, bigotry, and violence on many sides. On many sides. It's been going on for a long time in our country. Not Donald Trump, not Barack Obama. This has been going on for a long, long time. It has no place in America.
And with that, let me bring in our senior White House correspondent, Cecilia Vega, our senior Justice correspondent, Pierre Thomas. Cecilia, let me begin with you. The president's comments yesterday being met with a lot of fury, even by his own party. Some top senators right now. You've got Senator Orrin Hatch saying we should call evil by its name. My brother didn't give his life fighting Hitler for Nazi ideas to go unchallenged here at home. Marco Rubio. Very important for the nation to hear POTUS describe events in Charlottesville for what they are, a terror attack by white supremacists. Cory Gardner, senator from Colorado. Mr. President, we must call evil by its name. These were white supremacists, and this was domestic terrorism. The president's on Twitter this morning not taking back that many sides comment.
Yeah, he has yet to offer a full rebuke, George, even in the face of near universal condemnation. We're not just talking about Republicans in his own party. We're talking about some of his own supporters. Look, the White House is now trying to clarify what the president meant when he used that many sides comments. They say he was condemning hatred, bigotry, violence on all sides. But they say that there was violence between protesters and counter-protesters. But look, George, I've got to tell you, Ivanka Trump this morning tweeted stronger words than her own father. She said there's no place in society. She used the words for racism, white supremacy, neo-Nazi. The president didn't outright denounce neo-Nazis. He didn't use the word white supremacist. It took him hours to condemn this publicly. The first lady was the first person in the White House to come out and offer a White House official condemnation. The president, we saw him on camera yesterday there in Bedminster. He was asked point blank by reporters in that room whether he wants the support of these white supremacists, and he ignored that that question, George, I think we're looking here at a potential history-making moment for this presidency and how he handles this question before him. Will he outright denounce these groups, many of which have come to his support?
It certainly does feel like a watershed moment. Pierre, we have seen stronger actions, at least immediately, from the Justice Department.
George, the Justice Department, recognizing that a car was used as a murder weapon, quickly launched a civil rights investigation to determine whether this was a hate crime. That means this morning FBI agents are looking at that 20-year-old suspect's background, dissecting his life. Who are his friends and associates back in Ohio? In addition to interviews of those who know him, expect agents to conduct searches of his home, workplace, and to exploit his computers and phones. They want to know if he has ties to organized hate groups, white supremacists, or others. And George, while anyone who engaged in violence was wrong, the protesters and counter-protesters, the catalyst for the violence were the Klansmen, the neo-Nazis, and the white supremacists who have a documented history of hate and violence. This morning, there's a need to know if this movement is re-emerging and gathering steam, George.
And we're going to have more on that. Pierre and Cecilia, both stand by. I want to bring in our panel for more on this as well. Matthew Dowd, the president did not seem prepared for the magnitude of this moment.
Not at all. I mean, first, the man and the movement need to be held totally, strictly accountable. The guy that did this and the movement that he represented needs to be held accountable on this. But to sort of step back and reflect a moment on this, everybody at this table's family and individuals and their ancestors have in some way been harmed by white supremacists over the years, whether it's Latinos, people of Jewish ancestry, women, Irish Catholics, Greeks, they've all been it. But even more so, I went to the new American History Museum of the American Revolution in Philly on Friday, and they have its beautiful place, and they have Washington's tent, right, that he lived in, basically, and operated out of for 5 years. And if you think about moments in our history, we haven't always honored that sacrifice that has been done by people. We've had interned Japanese. It took us 100 years before we banned slavery in our country. It took us another 100 years before we dealt with civil rights. Women didn't get the right to vote for 150 years. And even more so, I think when you take about this, who shares responsibility in this? Who shares responsibility? It's not only the man, it's not only the movement, but anybody that points their fingers at Mexicans and Muslims shares responsibility.
Well, the president has to share responsibility. The fact is that through that campaign, he blew all kinds of whistles that those of us who grew up in the Jim Crow South, like I did, recognized immediately. It was just calling out to these white supremacists who then felt empowered by it. And the president now not calling them out. You know, he should listen to Nikki Haley, his now UN ambassador. She's the person who started bringing down Confederate monuments.
To the point.
And she did it so graciously in exactly the right tone after the killings at Mother Emanuel Church.
To the point of those emboldened by the president's words, David Duke on Friday night, Alex Castellanos, here's what he said: we're determined to take our country back. We're going to fulfill the promises of Donald Trump. That's what we believed in. That's why we voted for Donald Trump. The president can't seem to find the words to denounce this.
There are times this president seems to trip over his own ego, that he doesn't do what even he, I think, knows is the right thing and the politically popular thing just because the media and his adversaries expect him to do it. I hope what he was talking about here, about that others have been involved in this, was something larger. And I hope it's that in our celebration of multiculturalism in this country, we've lost the idea of American culture. We've lost the idea of citizenship, the idea that there are big things and shared values that unite us. And in that sense, yes, I think we're all responsible for a country that looks at what divides us and pits us against each other as opposed to the big things that bring us together. I hope that's where Trump was going.
But it starts with the condemnation of those causing the violence. And Ben Rhodes, you work with President Obama. We saw a rare tweet from him yesterday, Nelson Mandela.
Yes. Well, and George, look, all of us who've worked in the White House know that these are critical moments. I think of President Obama going down to Charleston after a white supremacist killing, President Clinton in Oklahoma City, President Bush after 9/11. You know, this is a living office, and what we saw yesterday really is a president surrendering the moral authority of the office of the President of the United States. And I think there are huge costs to that for the nation, because people look to a president to put these events in context and to bring people together. And he did the opposite.
Cecilia Vega, let me bring you back in on that point. When I was talking to H.R. McMaster, we're going to have most of his interview coming up later, but he did at least call out the act of the driver an act of domestic terrorism. It doesn't appear yet that the president is prepared to clarify in a way that his critics would hear.
No, I mean, and the clarification that the White House offered doesn't really offer any clarification, if you will. And you mentioned it at the top of the show, George, that tweet that the president had very early this morning in the middle of the night. I mean, frankly, bizarre. He said he sent his best regards to all of those injured and condolences to the family of the young woman killed today. Let's just go back a few months to when President Trump was harshly and roundly criticized for delaying his rebuke of David Duke. And he was asked point blank, do you denounce David Duke? And it took him a long time to come around and finally offer that. You know, I think people want to hear a president in this case emboldened and say these words. He hasn't yet. You heard Joe Biden tweet directly, there is one side on this. There are not many sides. So we potentially may have a press conference tomorrow. And you can bet if that happens, George, this will be front and center in those questions that get asked of the president.
Pierre Thomas, you know, we have seen a rise in hate crimes being documented by the Justice Department over this last year.
George, while the country has made great progress in terms of racism remains a disease that plagues this country. It's like cancer. Even when it's in remission, it's still a threat. Since 2000, we've seen a 52% increase in the number of hate groups. There were 602 hate groups in 2000. There are now 917, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center. So this is a really significant issue that always is lurking in the background, ready to explode.
Cokie Roberts, one of the things we're going to learn here is, can the president learn from his mistakes?
Well, we haven't seen that in the past. And the question is whether he can do it in the future. But this is also a really watershed moment for the Justice Department, because it's not just that they're categorizing these hate crimes. Jeff Sessions has gone back on a lot of these things having to do with race. Taking a look at the Obama federal investigations of how police treat people of color. He's saying, let's not do that anymore. He's saying, let's keep voting rights suppressed. He's doing a lot of things that send signals to these white supremacists.
I've learned a lot in life and in politics that usually the first response of what somebody does is usually what they mean. Right? And in the course of this, the president's first response on many things is what he really means. Ban Muslims and whatever he happens to do. I think when you step back from this, they're going to clean this up. They're going to attempt to clean this up. But we already know where the president really is on this.
Birtherism is how he launched it.
You cannot celebrate and reap the profits of the Hunger Games and then step back and say, how did that happen? And that's just what's happening right now.
I want to have you all back later in the program, but we're going to get more on this now from Anthony Scaramucci. If all had gone as planned, he would have been advising the president yesterday as White House Communications Director. Instead, he was out after just 11 days on the job.
Here's what I will tell you, okay? I love the president.
We're going to stop the leaks. And if we don't stop the leaks, I'm going to stop you. It's just really that simple.
Well, I'm a Wall Street guy, and I'm more of a front-stabbing person. and I'd rather tell people directly how I feel about them.
If Reince wants to explain that he's not a leaker, let him do that. Reince is a paranoid schizophrenic, paranoiac.
Putting Anthony Scaramucci in that job was like throwing a grenade into an ongoing civil war in the White House.
Tonight, standing in the pouring rain, President Trump announced that Reince Priebus, his chief of staff, is out.
This is an ABC News special report.
ABC News has learned that Anthony Scaramucci, the White House Communications Director who just started 10 days ago, is now leaving. And Anthony Scaramucci is right here, right now. Thank you for coming on This Week. First interview since you left the White House. I have to start with the president's statement yesterday. If you were White House Communications Director yesterday, would you advise he give that statement?
Well, I wouldn't have recommended that statement. I think he needed to be much harsher as it related to the white supremacists and the nature of that. I applaud General McMaster for calling it out for what it is. It's actually terrorism, and whether it's domestic or international terrorism, with the moral authority of the presidency, you have to call that stuff out.
But the question is, why didn't the president do that? You know him well.
Well, I think Alex mentioned one of the reasons why he doesn't like doing that. He likes doing the opposite of what the media thinks he's going to do. I think he's also of the impression that there is hatred on all sides. But I disagree with it. And so, but here's the thing, whether I was the White House Communications Director or not, I don't think you're going to change the president. The president's going to do what he wants to do, how he wants to do it. But I think it's important for the people around him, George, to give them direct advice, to be blunt with him. I think he respects bluntness and he respects candor. And I certainly would have never suggested him doing that.
But is there anyone in the White House right now who said, boy, you just made a real mistake there?
I think people are probably reluctant to tell him the truth. Maybe Ivanka would do that. You saw her tweet this morning. Maybe Jared would do that. But you also got this sort of Bannon-Bart influence in there, which I think is a snag on the president. If the president really wants to execute that legislative agenda that I think is so promising for the American people, the lower middle class people and the middle class people, then he has to move away from that sort of Bannon-Bart nonsense.
So you mean Bannon and Breitbart, Steve Bannon?
The whole thing is nonsensical. It's not serving the president's interests. He's got to move more into the mainstream. He's got to be more into where the moderates are and the independents are, George, that love the president. And so if he does that, he'll have a very successful legislative agenda that he'll be able to execute. And if he doesn't do that, you're going to see this inertia and you're going to see this resistance from more of the establishment senators that he needs to curry favor with.
Tough on Steve Bannon. Does he have to go?
Well, I think the president knows what he's going to do with Steve Bannon.
Which is what?
Well, let's leave it up to the president. It's his decision. But, I mean, at the end of the day, I think the president has a very good idea of who the leakers are inside the White House. The president has a very good idea of the people that are undermining his agenda that are serving their own interests.
They include Steve Bannon?
Oh, yeah. Like, look, I mean, we're not on a phone call and a tape phone call, and so we're on live television, and so I would prefer to let the president make the decisions that the president needs to make.
You mentioned that tape phone call. That may have been what got you fired from the White House. Let's show everybody what you said.
I'm not Steve Bannon. No. I'm not trying to build my own brand off strength of the president. And Ryan's is paranoid schizophrenic, paranoiac. And what he's going to do is, oh, maybe Bill Shine's coming. Let me leak thing and see if I these people the way I Scaramucci for 6 months. Okay, the mooch showed up a week ago. This is going to get cleaned up very shortly, okay, because I nailed these guys. I got digital fingerprints on everything that they've done through the FBI and the Department of Justice.
What's the worst thing?
It's no. Oh, well, the felony, they're going to get prosecuted probably for the felony. They'll probably get prosecuted for that. Okay.
Yeah. Wow.
Okay, lie detector stars. Yeah.
Of course, that was your conversation with Ryan Lizza of The New Yorker.
Which, for the record, I thought was off the record. And
but you
for
didn't
the
ask for it to be off the record.
I understand that, but this is the reason why the media gets a bad shake from the American people. That was a very deceitful thing that he did. He knows, based on my prior relationship with him.
Lots of reporters take phone calls.
George, I didn't say I didn't do the wrong thing. I want to be totally accountable for what I did. And obviously, I paid the consequences of having that sort of a conversation with him. But you know and I know that there are personal relationships. Howie Kurtz mentioned it on Media Buzz last week. He didn't need to do that to me. He knows he didn't do that to me.
He didn't have any personal relationship with you until he met you in the green room earlier this year.
Okay, that's a little bit of a stretch, because we did have several conversations. His family knew my family for 50 years. It's a little bit of a stretch. But we don't need to debate that anymore. That's past news. I made a mistake. I'm accountable for the mistake. I paid the consequences of that mistake. And, you know, I was honorably dismissed, and I took it.
A lot of reports that the president's initial reaction to the phone call wasn't all that harsh. He was kind of amused by it and actually liked a lot of it.
Well, I got to let the president speak for that, but I think you have to understand something. There were probably 1 or 2 people that wanted me in that job, the president being one of them, and there were probably 200 people that didn't want me in that job. And so you know Washington as well as I know Washington. The odds were stacked against me in the job. And so there were leaks, and there was a repetitive process to try to dislodge me. I made an unforced error. That made it easy to dismiss me. And so, like I said, I accept it. What I did was wrong. But we have to move on, and I think the agenda that the American people want is middle class and lower income tax relief. I think they want the opportunity to see their wages grow, and I think the president stands for that. I think we have to put all of ourselves below that agenda. That agenda supersedes everybody else.
But you were pretty loyal to the president. Did he even call you to let you know?
I talked to the president this week. We had a very candid conversation. You know, listen, there's probably mutual disappointment on both sides. Again, I have to be accountable for what I did, and I am.
So you think you deserve to be fired for that?
Do I think I deserve to be fired? Well, obviously, I wish they would have given me a bar of soap and told me to go wash my mouth out in the bathroom and move on. I don't necessarily think it was going to be very hard for me to stay in the job, given the fact that General Kelly took over. And so I respect General Kelly. And so my feeling about the whole thing is that what happened was sort of meant to happen.
A couple of specific things in that phone call I want to follow up on. You talked about those digital fingerprints you got from the FBI and the DOJ. What are you talking about?
Because that was totally misconstrued. And
did you make it up?
No. All I was trying to say is that in the process, and I think Attorney General Sessions had said this, is that, and he also displayed that in his press briefing, is that over time, if the leaking continued, particularly the leaking that was against the
But you didn't have any digital fingerprints of people.
No. I was just implying that at some point the Department of Justice would be able to figure out who the leakers are inside the national security system that are actually doing things that are against the law.
Right, but you had not received anything, because that would have been a felony from the person who gave it to you.
No, I didn't receive anything. No, we were, again, I thought that was an off-the-record conversation with somebody. It turned out that it wasn't. I own it, and let's move on.
You also, in that phone conversation, talked about Vice President Pence, and you were asked about his bringing in this political operative, Nick Ayers, to run his operation. And you told Ryan Lizza, Nick is there to protect the VP because the VP can't believe what the F is going on.
Yeah, okay, so let's talk about that, because that's also been misconstrued. You have to remember what Ryan Lizza did with his article. He wrote the article like I was unhinged and overly emotional and bombastic.
Well, those are your words, though. I mean.
Okay, but when you hear the tape, it's a very normal conversation. So the words were mischaracterized in the original article. He's mischaracterizing again.
He's not misquoting you, though.
He's not misquoting me, but he is mischaracterizing, because you know
he's
there's
just putting
a lot.
The words out there.
Okay, but George, there's a lot of difference between the lip and cup of substance and style. Okay, the way we're talking right now is actually the way I was talking to him. I thought it was off the record. We can leave it at that.
I want to talk about the substance there. So what did you mean by the Vice President can't believe what the F is going on?
What I meant by that is that he needed, in my opinion, he needed to fortify himself with somebody as talented as Nick Ayers, so that, you know, the Vice President is an extremely loyal guy. I'm a huge fan of the Vice President. I wasn't recommending in that conversation that there was a breach or any daylight between the President and the Vice President. I'm a huge supporter of Vice President Pence and Nick Ayers, and all I meant was that Nick Ayers is a very strong political player. He was going to be in there to protect the Vice President. What do I mean by that? The Vice President wants to stay loyal to the President's agenda and to the President and his family, and Nick is a very smart, sophisticated strategist that will help him do that.
It sounds like you're
nothing more to it than that, George.
But it sounds like, and from your characterization now, that you really think this White House is something of a hornet's nest right now. You talk about leakers. You talk about people inside the White House who are there to protect the country from President Trump. Who'd you have in mind there?
Well, I think that, listen, I mean, you could agree with me or disagree with me. Even the President could disagree with me. But I think what happens in Washington, this is my general observation, is the President is not a representative of the political establishment class. And so for whatever reason, people have made a decision that they want to eject him. It's almost like he's opened up the door now for America's CEOs and America's billionaires to enter the Washington political system. The members of that political class do not like that. And it's not just an opening for President Trump, but it could be for a Mark Zuckerberg.
So he's fighting an enemy within the White House?
I think that there are elements inside of Washington, also inclusive in the White House, that are not necessarily abetting the President's interests or his agenda. I absolutely believe that, yes.
Name names.
Well, I named some names, and there's been some strategic changes, and my guess is there'll be more strategic changes. I think the President's getting his arms around the fact that if he wants to prosecute his agenda, he's got to bring in loyalists to him, and he's got to bring in, I think, a different strategy than the one they're deploying, because you've got 7 months now. He's done a tremendous amount. I think he's done way better in terms of progress as president than's been prominently displayed. And, you know, one of my heartbreaks is I wasn't able to effectively communicate that to the American people.
Reince Priebus is out. Sean Spicer is out. You think it appears that Steve Bannon is going to be out as well. You are out as well. That's led a lot of people, including Roger Stone, to characterize you as a political suicide bomber.
Yeah, I heard that, yeah. Well, listen, I saw it more as like Mr. Wolf from Pulp Fiction. You know, I really did get it directed from the President. I had a mutual understanding with him, and I was probably running too hard and acting more like a corporate CEO than I was, say, a political operative, and that's my mistake, and I have to own that. But, you know, listen, I've embraced the agenda. I grew up in a middle-class family. I grew up in a working-class neighborhood. I see the economic desperation and struggle of those people. The President has appropriately identified that. The reason why he won the presidency is that he wants his agenda to include and to lift up those people, George. And so for me, I went in there with my heart and soul. I'm a straight talking person. Did I make mistakes? Absolutely. But I enjoy being a straight-up guy today and in the future.
One of the things you advised President Trump against was firing Robert Mueller. Robert Mueller's investigation now a real threat to this White House. Just a report in the New York Times this morning that he's reaching into the White House for interviews with White House, current and former White House staffers.
I predict he will not find anything related to President Trump or his family as it relates to the Russia situation.
Was it a hard sell to convince the president not to fire Robert Mueller?
Not at all. I don't think he had any. I don't think he has any intention. I mean, I don't know, but I'm just.
But you talked to him about it.
I don't think he has any intention of firing Robert Mueller.
But when you were talking to him about it, he was musing about that. He was saying, "Boy, I think about it." You said you advised him against it.
I don't think so. I think he's just, again, he's a pretty much one of the things that the American people like about President Trump. He's pretty much an open book. I think the Twitter experience has exposed that he has an open book, hard on his sleeve nature. I don't think he wants to fire Robert Mueller, and I think he's very confident that Robert Mueller's not going to find anything related to him or his family or people in his inner circle.
He also told you, though, that it wasn't the Russians. The Russians didn't get into this interference because if they did, we wouldn't have known about it. And I think, one of the things a lot of people wonder about, they saw the president this week refuse to criticize Vladimir Putin. They saw how tough he was, tougher on Mitch McConnell than he was on Vladimir Putin. They saw him yesterday not call out the white supremacists. How do you explain that reluctance, especially on Vladimir Putin? Why does he refuse to criticize Vladimir Putin?
Well, listen, again, this is my observation over 18 months working pretty closely in the campaign and then the few days I had in the administration. I think that the president's attitude is that he wants to have a good relationship with Vladimir Putin. A real reset to him would be to make that relationship friendlier, less hostile, and find common interests. And so some of the members of the media don't want him to do that, but I think that those are his instincts, and my guess is it will go directionally in a positive way.
It sounds like he's making excuses for Vladimir Putin.
See, I don't see it that way. I see it as a strong CEO that's now the American president that's making counterintuitive decisions that may not be liked by members of the media, but may be in the best interest of the people of the United States. And so I don't have an issue with that. I think with Senator McConnell, I think it's a different story there. I think all he's basically trying to say to the senator is we got to all get on side. We got to row the boat directionally in the same way. We want to get some huge legislative victories. The health care reform as an example, the tax relief and tax reform is another example of that. And we got to row the boat directionally in the same way. And so I think he's just, it's almost like a football coach talking to one of the players on the team, and the president is he could be a tough coach at times, but I'll tell you what, the Republicans should be very happy that he's on their team because this guy's a winner.
Anthony Scaramucci, thanks for your time this morning.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
And Mr. Scaramucci, we'll take your questions live. Head to the ABC News Facebook page this morning for more on that. And when we come back, the escalating tensions with North Korea. Martha Raddatz reports live from the border from that reclusive nation. We're going to ask President Trump's national security advisor what the U.S. is going to do next.
This week,
the latest now on that North Korean nuclear threat. All week long, President Trump has ratcheted up the rhetoric from fire and fury to locked and loaded. Kim Jong-un has responded in kind with threats of new missile tests aimed at Guam. And as the tensions escalate, our chief global affairs anchor, Martha Raddatz, is on the front lines of a possible war, reporting from Seoul, South Korea. Good morning, Martha.
Good morning, George. In the past week, there has been a doubling, even tripling down on the threatening rhetoric President Trump has been launching at Kim Jong-un. And the North Korean regime has verbally fired back with threats that, if acted on, could begin a horrific cycle of violence. This morning, a 35-mile trip to the border, to the demilitarized zone, where some 14,000 North Korean artillery pieces point towards South Korea's capital, a direct threat to the 26 million people who live in Seoul. Whenever there are visitors to the DMZ, soldiers stand guard, soldiers from the U.S. and from South Korea. We're, of course, on the South Korean side. But where that gravel ends and the sand begins, that's North Korea. Lieutenant Commander Daniel McShane has been at this remote site for 4.5 years. Like the nearly 30,000 U.S. forces elsewhere in South Korea, he says they are always ready.
The rhetoric heat is probably more than I've seen, personally.
It is more than anyone has ever seen from a U.S. president. Tuesday.
North Korea best not make any more threats to the United States. They will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen.
Friday.
And if anything happens to Guam, there's going to be big, big trouble in North Korea.
It was Wednesday that Kim's regime threatened to send 4 missiles to the waters off Guam and called President Trump's threats nonsense. This bellicose tit-for-tat has frayed nerves in the region, with Kim Jong-un believed to have miniaturized a nuclear weapon now. Many are urging restraint.
President Trump came up with the wording of fire and fury. That is why we are so much concerned.
Which is not what President Moon wanted.
Of course he doesn't want, and Korean people want either. It's a chicken game, but I think that what is needed right now is a mutual self-restraint.
Moon Chang-in is a top advisor to the new president of South Korea.
We are very much confused. Therefore, we think that now the American government has moved from strategic patience of Obama administration into strategic confusion.
But what seems clear is that while the U.S. military continues to flex its military muscle here and touts its readiness to fight tonight, there are no new ships being sent to the region, no mobilization of additional forces to back up the president's fiery warnings. But after years of essentially punting the North Korean nuclear problem, the danger that country now poses is undeniable, and it will now be up to President Trump to decide how to handle it once and for all. George?
Martha Raddatz, thanks. We're going to bring in now the President's National Security Advisor, General H.R. McMaster. General McMaster, thanks for joining us this morning. I want to get to North Korea in a second, but first, there's been so much fallout to the president's comments yesterday about Charlottesville, including this from Richard Haass, the chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations, who says the U.S. ability to persuade other governments to fight terrorism diminish when POTUS fails to call it out, take it on at home. The example we set matters. How do you respond to that criticism?
Well, the president's been very clear. We cannot tolerate this kind of bigotry, this kind of hatred. And what he did is he called on all Americans to take a firm stand against it. This is a great opportunity for us to ask ourselves, what are we teaching our children? Tolerance has to overcome this kind of hatred that is grounded really in ignorance of our values and what makes us unique as Americans, our commitment to each other, our commitment to freedom, liberty, tolerance, and rights for all.
Well said, sir, but he didn't call out the white supremacy for the violence. You know, when it comes to radical Islamic terrorism, the president says you can't solve the problem if you don't say the name. Doesn't that hold true for domestic terrorism as well?
What the president did is he called out anyone who is responsible for fomenting this kind of bigotry, hatred, racism, and violence. And I think the president was very clear on that. I'm sorry?
That seemed to be suggesting moral equivalence between those who started the violence and those who were protesting.
Maybe to you, George, but not to me. I think the president was very clear. And so was the Attorney General in his statement.
Let's move on now to North Korea. Are we closer to war now than we were a week ago?
No, I don't think so. And I think we're not closer to war than a week ago. But we are closer to war than we were a decade ago. And as Dr. Kissinger made clear in a great op-ed this weekend, this has been a problem that we've procrastinated on for a long period of time. And now it's coming to a head where the threat from North Korea, not only to the United States, but to the world, is very, very clear. And it demands a concerted effort by the United States, but with our allies and with all responsible nations. And this is what you've seen the president do, is bring together all nations to bear on this problem. And I think notably, you had the UN Security Council resolution 15-0 this past week. Great work by our Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, and our ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley. But what's clear now is our interests are aligned with all responsible nations. And it's time for all nations, including China, Russia, as well as our close allies, Japan and South Korea, to work together toward a common goal of denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula.
What do you say to the president's critics who say his rhetoric was just too hot this week? He went too far.
Well, the president made clear, that the United States will not tolerate our citizens or our allies being threatened by this rogue regime. And I think there's a much greater danger if there were to be any kind of degree of ambiguity in connection with the kind of response that Kim Jong-un could expect if he were to threaten the United States or our allies.
But there did seem to be ambiguity in the president's statement. His fire and fury statement was he said they would be met by fire and fury if there were new threats from North Korea. There are new threats from North Korea every single day. They've already crossed that line.
Yeah, there certainly are. And what you've seen is our response. Our response is we are prepared militarily to deal with this if necessary. But we're taking all possible actions, short of military action, to resolve this very grave threat to the United States and the world. And that includes a very determined diplomatic effort led by our Secretary of State. And it also includes increasing sanctions, increasing pressure on the North to convince Kim Jong-un that this is not in his interest to continue this path of provocation and escalatory actions.
But just to be clear, threats alone will not provoke a U.S. military response, will they?
Well, it depends on the nature of the threat, right? And so this is why what Kim Jong-un is doing is very, very dangerous. Now, of course, any response that we have, we do in close cooperation with our allies in the region. And as you know, we have been prepared. We have been prepared for any escalation on the Korean Peninsula since the armistice in 1953. So the difference between then and now is the danger is much greater and is growing every day with every missile test, with the consideration of possibly a 6th nuclear test. And so what we can no longer do is afford to procrastinate. And President Trump has made it very clear. He cannot tolerate, will not tolerate a threat to the United States from North Korea involving nuclear weapons.
But your predecessor, Susan Rice, wrote this week that the U.S. could tolerate nuclear weapons in North Korea the same way we tolerated nuclear weapons in the Soviet Union far more during the Cold War. Is she right?
No, she's not right. And I think the reason she's not right is that the classical deterrent does that apply to a regime like the regime in North Korea, a regime that engages in unspeakable brutality against its own people, a regime that poses a threat to in the region and now may pose a direct threat to the United States with weapons of mass destruction, a regime that imprisons and murders anyone who seems to oppose that regime, including members of his own family, using sarin nerve gas in a public airport.
So we are locked and loaded?
The United States military is locked and loaded every day, and especially those who are on the front lines of freedom, such as those that are stationed in South Korea and those soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines that are stationed in Northeast Asia or rotate there. So, as you know, we have tremendous military capabilities. We have a very high degree of readiness, and so the United States military is always locked and loaded. But the purpose of capable, ready forces is to preserve peace and prevent war. George Washington said it. The most effective way of preserving peace is to be prepared for war.
Let me talk about Venezuela. The president raised a lot of eyebrows on Friday when he said U.S. military intervention is on the table. Let's look.
And by the way, I'm not going to rule out a military option. We have many options for Venezuela. A military operation and military option is certainly something that we could pursue.
But just last week, you said this. I want to play that as well.
Do you see a military intervention from any outside source?
No, I don't think so. I think what's really required is for everyone to have one voice about the need to protect the rights and the safety of the Venezuelan people.
So what changed? What would be the purpose of military intervention?
Well, the president's main focus is on the rights and safety of the Venezuelan people. And what's moved the president in this last week is the escalation of the violence, the regime's violence, these thugs who operate in the name of Maduro against the legitimate opposition to his new dictatorship. So he's choking out democracy in Venezuela, but he's also visiting violence on his own people. He is arresting mayors, opposition mayors in cities, and sentencing them to a year to 15 months in jail. You've seen what he just did recently with his attorney, extremely courageous woman. And also you've seen what these thugs have been doing. They've been sniping at, killing, murdering protesters
all
in the
that
street.
is horrific, sir. I agree with you, but you know that we have those kinds of conditions in many countries. Is U.S. military intervention really on the table? What vital U.S. interest is at stake?
Well, what's critical is in the path forward is to do everything we can with our partners in the region. And I'll tell you George, I think we are better aligned with our partners in Latin America than we've been in
But
a long,
are we
long
considering
time.
military intervention?
The president has asked us to look at what could happen next. What could happen in Venezuela? We want to not only be able to cope with the current situation, but understand better how this crisis might evolve. And when you look at contingencies, when you look at what if the suffering of the Venezuelan people increases by orders of magnitude? What more can we do with our partners in the region to protect the Venezuelan people and to prevent an even greater humanitarian catastrophe? So the president never takes options off the table in any of these situations, and what we owe him are options. And so what are we doing now? What we're doing now is we're working very closely with our partners in the region. You know, just last week in Panama, 16 countries met in Peru. 16 countries met in Peru. They signed a very strong statement against Maduro and his extinguishing of democracy in Venezuela. And so we'll continue a series of actions against the Maduro regime, which aim to strengthen the opposition and to reach out to those who are members of this oppressive regime to tell them it's time to reconsider your actions and your support for this dictator.
Finally, sir, do you consider that car attack in Charlottesville yesterday an act of domestic terrorism?
I certainly think any time that you commit an attack against people to incite fear, it is terrorism. It meets the definition of terrorism. But what this is, what you see here, is you see someone who is a criminal, who is committing a criminal act against fellow Americans, a criminal act that may have been motivated, and we'll see what's turned up in this investigation by this hatred and bigotry, which I mentioned we have to extinguish in our nation. And we have to do that by asking ourselves, what are we teaching our children around the dinner table? What are we teaching our children in school? And we ought to be teaching them about what makes America exceptional. And that's our commitment to the rights of every individual, liberty, freedom, respect for each other, regardless of race, religion, and so forth. So this is, I think, what we ought to all ask ourselves. And as we send our condolences out to the victims of this terrible violence, we ought to ask ourselves, what more can all of us do?
We certainly should. General McMaster, thanks for your time this morning.
Thank you, George.
We'll be back with the roundtable in just a minute. And we are back with the roundtable. I want to bring in Ben Rhodes. You served on the National Security Council with President Obama. You just heard General McMaster right there. A couple headlines. We're no closer to war with North Korea. He says there's no problem with the president's rhetoric. And he also said, and I think this ends up being the important line, we cannot tolerate nuclear weapons in North Korea.
Well, look, the fact is, George, North Korea tested its first nuclear device in 2006. We do have to apply pressure on North Korea. There's a UN Security Council resolution imposing new sanctions. But we should not be manufacturing a crisis, which is what President Trump did with his words. And look, what's clear to me is those words were not coordinated with our allies, Japan and South Korea. They were not even coordinated
no strategy
with
the State Department.
No, not only is there no strategy, but it's dangerous. Let's be very clear. A war with North Korea would likely take hundreds of thousands of lives, including tens of thousands of Americans who are serving and living in South Korea. And the fact is, by making those threats to North Korea, what happens if the North Koreans misread a U.S. military movement in the region and respond? What happens if there's a North Korean provocation and we're out over our skis because of President Trump's rhetoric and suddenly we're escalating? This is a very dangerous situation.
And Alex, you know, we were told that General Kelly was going to make a big difference in the White House, but the person he even concedes he probably can't manage is the president himself. You wonder what General Kelly is thinking when the president brings up fire and fury without apparently running it by his national security advisors, even though he had used the words in the past, when he brings up the possibility of military intervention in Venezuela.
It's like on a Friday afternoon, you have nothing else. Oh, we got 10 minutes, let's declare war on Venezuela. I think General Kelly, you saw that, well, they made the explanation, yes, this was a coordinated message from the White House, and immediately thereafter, Sarah Huckabee Sanders had to explain, no, but this is the boss. This is his voice. So I think the boss is the one who gets the credit for everything in this White House. But in a strange way, though, this is Donald Trump. We can't, again, take him literally, but take him seriously. This is Donald Trump, an embrace and a threat at the same time. The truth is somewhere in the middle. It's never in the extreme. You know, in many ways, I think this situation is ready to de-escalate at this point, because Trump, because Kim Jong what he wanted.
But you know,
he's got America validating the threat that keeps Kim Jong-un in power. So maybe now I think that this...
Unless we're serious about no nuclear weapons in North Korea.
Which would be, then what do? How do you get them out of there? All of that. And, you know, really going back and listening, and I've listened to all of the tapes around the Cuban Missile Crisis. And Jack Kennedy, this young president that nobody trusted, is really saying to all of his military and congressional advisors, we're not going to do that. We're not going to declare war and go into Cuba. And they're saying you're being chicken, we need to do this. Even Bill Fulbright, who ended up being the big dub in Vietnam, saying we got to get in there, Mr. President. It's usually the president who has the big picture and calms everybody down, whether it's Truman firing MacArthur and saying we're not going to have a land war in Asia, or Eisenhower saying we're not going to send troops to Vietnam. It's the president who does that. The president doesn't
Trump's
give
history
things
as
up.
being a non-interventionist.
But Kennedy learned from the mistakes of Bay of Pigs, right? So he actually changed his own mistakes he made in the Bay of Pigs, and then he conducted the Cuban Missile Crisis different. I think we have to dispense with the fiction and come up with a different foreign policy. The fiction that we're somehow going to stop North Korea from getting a nuclear weapon, we ought to just dispense with that fiction. And we ought to deal with them just like the same way we deal with Pakistan. We were going to stop Pakistan. Right. Pakistan got a nuclear weapon, and now we have a foreign policy that's surrounded by deterrence and containment. We finally have to do that. The other part of this is, let's remember, we helped create this problem. It was 1945 when we arbitrarily drew a line between North Korea and South Korea, just like we arbitrarily drew lines in World War I and faced 100 years of problems in the Middle East. We have to figure out, instead of us imposing on North Korea and South Korea, we have to figure out a way that they lead on this.
Can we de-escalate?
Look, or
that is the last word
of Donald
right there.
Trump.
Right.